Hello, friends. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Audrey Wansink, and today I will be presenting. My presentation today is called Turning Floods into Friends. Now, I think you guys are probably all thinking that sounds strange at first because floods are known to destroy homes, roads, farms, and entire communities. So calling this presentation Turning Floods into Friends probably sounds ridiculous to you guys, because nobody sees flood warnings and thinks, wow, this is great news. So here's the thing. Floods are not just disasters. They're also natural systems. This is what rivers have been doing for thousands of years. They help replenish the soil, restore groundwater, support ecosystems, and help reshape our landscapes. So the question I want to explore today is, do floods have to be just destructive and disastrous? Or have we become so focused on fighting water that we have ignored the benefits floods can actually provide for us? I feel like throughout this water course, I studied both water shortages and flooding. I looked at droughts in Kansas, different irrigation systems, specific precision irrigation systems, flooding in the Mississippi, as well as desalination and groundwater depletion. So I feel like I got to see both sides of not having enough water as well as having too much water. So this was what I thought was interesting. Maybe our solution to water shortages might actually come from our problem of having too much water. I also just want to give a shout out to Dr. Peter McIntyre, who actually was a guest lecturer for us, and his work is focused on river health and ecology. So this made me really wonder, what are the benefits to floods and how can we design around them? The problem is that modern society treats every flood like an enemy to eliminate as fast as possible. We need to get the water out of here. We build levees, dams, dikes, flood walls, and concrete channels, which can be designed to force the water away immediately. And while I feel like that protects us in some ways, it also means that we lose a lot of the benefits that floods naturally provide. I mean, don't get me wrong, floods can definitely be dangerous and destructive, but this approach creates hidden costs. When we force our water downstream so quickly, we can actually worsen flooding for communities that are farther down the stream or river. And the question I want to put here today is there a smarter balance between protection and cooperation within our natural systems? Our current approach and our problem approach is to resist any flooded waters. We try to channel the water away as fast as possible and resist any ground given to water and just treat it as an emergency, right? But what costs us, obviously beyond the billions of infrastructure that we lose, is all of the water that's rushing away, making flooding worse for communities. We lose fresh water and maybe hopefully our refilled aquifers. We take away the nutrient-rich topsoil that floods might have deposited into our farmland. Our wetlands dry up, our fish populations decline, and then our ecosystem that originally was depending on seasonal flooding just doesn't get what it needs. So what we do is we spend a fortune, trying to manage this water, but we're still losing things in the process. So we want to find an approach that doesn't just minimize the damage, but actually captures some of the value that floods bring with them. Here's the thing. Floods aren't new. They have been here since the time of history, right? And humans have been living with them for thousands of years. But what's interesting is mostly in history, people didn't fear floods. They really depended on them. Historically, a lot of ancient civilizations, like in ancient Egypt, when the Nile flooded every year, that civilization was literally built on that cycle. The farmers didn't really dread the flood. They were waiting for it. Here are a couple benefits that I feel like we usually ignore. And I touched on these a bit, but aquifer recharge, soil renewal, it helps sustain our wetlands, and it also helps with our fish biodiversity. One thing that I wanted to focus on was the aquifer recharge and soil renewal, because I feel like those are the most direct connection to the water shortage problem that we've been looking at all semester. When floodwater spreads out and gets to slow down, it has time to soak underground instead of, being rushed away. Um, Being able to refill and recharge these aquifers can help ensure that our communities are able to rely on it long after the flood is over, especially in drought-prone regions. Something that I thought was pretty interesting, and I actually put a photo of it over here, is anatomy of a rain garden. So it's basically a garden that's built on a slope that allows natural flooding, and it allows natural fertilizers with the soil as well as all that water to pull down and give it a rich, fertile place for these plants to grow. Floods can also improve soil quality. Floodwater carries sediment full of nutrients and organic matter. And according to research, floodplain soils can actually produce crop yields 20 to 30% higher than upland soils. But this is what's amazing, is that this happens completely naturally without any synthetic fertilizers. Excess water from floods can actually help solve drought and agricultural problems. The main three benefits are more focused on ecosystem and biodiversity. First is fish biodiversity. A lot of fish species really depend on seasonal floods, which are perfect and ideal for spawning. Without these floods, it can allow fish populations to collapse, which ends up reducing our biodiversity. These nursery habitats disappear and our fish populations decline. Here's a photo I added of fishes that are in a flooded basement. Fish, they found their way into a flooded basement. Second is wetland health. Wetlands are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, and they filter water, they absorb carbon, they support wildlife, and reduce storm damage. But they require flooding to survive. When rivers are overly controlled, these wetlands dry, and then they end up losing their functions. So, I have these photos of, animals enjoying the wetland. And third, I would say, is river health itself. Having floods honestly helps keep rivers clean, since it moves sediments, reshapes channels, and prevents stagnation for these bodies of water. So a river that never ends up flooding becomes less healthy over time because their natural cycle is interrupted. So since these floods are not just destructive events, they can slowly help ecosystems become healthier and function. So this is a cool example that I found. And this is where I found a concept from the Netherlands called Room for River, looking at what would a smarter system actually look like. Since the Netherlands face major flooding risks because much of the country sits below sea level, instead of just trying to block the water out, they started designing areas specifically where water is intentionally allowed to go there safely. You can tell, managing floods instead of only just fighting for them. They moved houses and made dikes and created a wider floodplain by creating artificial channels, which allowed new islands that people could use, as well as allowing the water to flow safely around. So if floods have benefits, what would a smarter system actually look like? What is actually creating friendly floods? First, flood buffers. There are certain low-value lands, farms, maybe wetlands, or open spaces that can be designated as overflow zones during floods. Second, expanded wetlands. Wetland areas are enlarged and connected to rivers so that they can naturally absorb the floodwater, as well as potentially refilling aquifers. Third is the smart overflow irrigation. Our excess floodwater can be diverted into different agricultural basins, or maybe like fields where it can recharge groundwater and benefit our crops instead of becoming wasted runoff. When water actually gets to sit in the soil, it actually helps instead of just running over the soil, taking away all the nutrients. I also wanted to think about maybe how could these ideas apply locally here in Ithaca? How can we bring it back home? We all know that Ithaca has steep terrain and fast-moving creeks and a lot of gorges as well as waterfalls, beautiful waterfalls, but it's also a very floodable area. One thing that we can do when we maybe experience heavy storms is have floodable parks. Maybe certain parks could be intentionally designed to temporarily hold our floodwater during these major storms. Here I have a photo of Ashley Stewart Park being flooded. Another idea is expanding wetlands and natural floodplains along maybe the creek corridors. If we have strategic expansion, we can absorb the surge water and end up filtering the runoff before it ends up reaching our neighborhoods. And finally, selective softening creek channels. So some creek sections are lined with hard rocks or like concrete that speed water downstream. In lower risk areas, if we're able to allow streams to spread out slightly, maybe that could slow flood surges and reduce damages. That also includes maybe adding in hard banks in these high impact areas, which can allow us to divert the water more strategically. So one thing that I noticed in my research is that flood management is usually reactive. When it comes to these like emergency responses, that usually happens after the threat appears. But what we can do is have a flood-friendly plan and have a strategy that has to happen before any rain comes. The first step would be to identify areas where flooding causes the least harm and the most benefit. The second would be preparation. We have to build channels, maybe lower some terrain here and there, and design spaces that can safely absorb the water and maybe even safely hold on and store that water if needed. Our third is activation. During flood events, water can be intentionally directed into designated areas and carefully managed. And fourth is compensation. Landowners who absorb floodwater may need financial support for either crop loss or maintenance costs. But even with this kind of compensation, using land strategically as flood buffers is often a lot cheaper than just rebuilding damaged infrastructure after major floods happen. So to conclude, I wanted to say that I started this project first asking whether or not floods could ever become something more than disasters. But I think we all know the answer now is yes. Floods recharge aquifers. They help us restore our soil as well as support our wetlands. They also protect biodiversity and maintain healthy rivers. Our current fight first approach right now may protect us in a lot of ways, but it also removes a lot of these benefits. Even different programs like Room from River in the Netherlands already show us that smarter flood management is already possible. But our biggest challenge right now is changing our mindset. We naturally think of these floods as our enemies, but rivers have always flooded and we have not always adapted. The question is not whether or not these floods will happen, but whether or not we're willing to design these systems that make floods work for us instead of against us. Thank you.